There is something happening in you that deserves honest attention, not the dramatic version, not the sudden, visible, externally confirmable transformation that spiritual content so often describes as awakening. Something quieter than that. Something that has been developing below the surface of the adapted life, the life organized around what was required, what was rewarded, what was safe to express, for longer than you may have consciously recognized. The authentic self does not emerge dramatically, it does not announce itself. It surfaces gradually in the specific, ordinary, often entirely unremarkable moments of daily life, through the small but genuine signals that something is shifting in the most fundamental relationship available to a human being. The relationship with the self that was always genuinely there beneath the adaptation. Gabor Maté spent his career understanding the adapted self, the specific, intelligent, entirely predictable self that forms in response to what the early environment could and could not hold. He understood it with clinical precision and with genuine compassion for the intelligence that built it. And he understood equally what the gradual emergence of the authentic self from beneath the adaptation actually looks like in the ordinary texture of a life. Today, I want to give you the 8 specific signs that this emergence is genuinely underway in your own life, not as aspiration, as description of something that may already be quietly happening. The first sign: you have begun to notice the gap between what you actually feel and what you say you feel. The adapted self closes this gap automatically. It generates the socially appropriate response, the fine, the good, the managed version of what is genuinely present before the genuine response has fully surfaced into awareness. The person whose authentic self is beginning to emerge starts to notice, in real time, that a gap exists, that what they are about to say and what they actually feel are not the same thing. This noticing is not yet the capacity to close the gap. That comes later, gradually. But the noticing itself is significant, because the gap that can be noticed is a gap that is beginning to be available to genuine choice, rather than simply running automatically below the threshold of conscious awareness. The second sign: certain obligations that you accepted without question have begun to feel genuinely questionable. The adapted self accepts obligations efficiently. It has been calibrated to the specific requirements of the environment, and it meets those requirements with the automatic compliance of a system that learned early that compliance was the most reliable available strategy for maintaining connection and safety. As the authentic self emerges, this automatic compliance begins to develop friction. Not rebellion in the performed sense, the specific, honest, interior quality of a self that is beginning to ask, perhaps for the first time in relation to certain long-standing commitments, whether this obligation is genuinely mine or whether it belongs to the adapted version of me that accepted it before the genuine self had adequate voice in the decision. The friction is uncomfortable. It produces the specific guilt of someone who is beginning to question what was previously unquestionable. But it is also, Gabor Maté observed, one of the most reliable signs that the genuine self is developing enough interior presence to begin evaluating the life from its own perspective rather than simply meeting the adaptation's requirements. The third sign: you find yourself genuinely moved by things that previously registered but did not fully land. The adapted self maintains a specific and largely unconscious distance from full emotional impact. This distance is not chosen. It is the natural consequence of a self organized around the management of emotional experience rather than its full receipt. Things are noted, appreciated, registered, but not quite fully felt in the specific, bodily, completely present way that genuine emotional impact requires. As the authentic self emerges, this distance begins to reduce. The piece of music that previously produced appreciation begins to produce something closer to genuine being moved. The moment of human tenderness that previously registered as touching begins to produce the specific quality of genuine emotional landing that the managed self's distance was preventing. The beauty that was noted from behind the management begins to actually arrive. This increase in genuine emotional impact can feel initially like becoming more sensitive in a way that is slightly alarming. It is not increased fragility, it is decreased distance. And decreased distance is one of the most consistent and most genuinely significant signs of authentic self-emergence. The fourth sign. You have developed a specific and growing intolerance for conversations that stay entirely at the surface. The adapted self is often skilled at surface conversation. It learned to navigate the social world at the level the social world most commonly operates, and it can do so with genuine warmth and genuine engagement. But as the authentic self emerges, the capacity for surface conversation begins to require more effort than it previously did, and the specific quality of genuine depth, when it appears in a conversation, produces a quality of aliveness that the surface conversation no longer matches. This is not contempt for ordinary social exchange. It is the authentic self's increasing preference for what it is actually nourished by. Genuine contact, honest exchange, the specific quality of conversation in which something real passes between two people, over what the adapted self learned to perform. And the preference, when it is honest rather than performed as spiritual superiority, is a reliable sign of genuine interior development. The fifth sign. Your relationship with solitude has changed. The adapted self often has a specific and characteristic relationship with solitude. Either it is avoided because the interior quiet activates the unprocessed material that the busyness and the social engagement manage into the background, or it is inhabited with a quality of restlessness that prevents it from being genuinely restorative. The solitude that is not genuinely comfortable is solitude in an interior environment that the self does not yet trust. As the authentic self emerges, the relationship with solitude begins to change. Not dramatically. The specific, quiet, gradually available experience of being genuinely at ease in one's own company, not as an achieved practice, but as the natural consequence of an interior environment that is becoming more genuinely inhabitable. The solitude that begins to feel more like genuine rest and less like the management of what arises in the absence of external engagement. This shift from solitude as something to be managed to solitude as something that is beginning to be genuinely nourishing is one of the quietest and most genuinely significant signs of authentic self-emergence that Gabor Maté observed. The sixth sign. You have begun making small choices from genuine preference rather than from habit or approval seeking. This sign is easy to overlook because of how small the choices often are, not the dramatic life reorganizing decisions. The specific, ordinary daily choices, what to spend a free hour on, which invitation to accept, which conversation to initiate, that the adapted self made from habit, from the management of impression, from the automatic generation of whatever seemed most likely to be approved of. As the authentic self emerges, genuine preference begins to appear in these small choices. The hour spent on what is genuinely nourishing, rather than on what seems most productive. The invitation declined not because of a prior commitment, but because the genuine self's honest assessment of what it needs today is different from what the invitation offers. The conversation initiated because something genuinely compels it, rather than because it maintains the right social connections. These small choices accumulate. Over time, they constitute something. A life that is slightly more genuinely organized around what is actually the self's own. And their accumulation is one of the most practically available and most genuinely significant indicators that the authentic self is developing real influence over the direction of the daily life. The seventh sign. Other people's assessments of you have become interesting rather than definitive. The adapted self is organized substantially around the management of how it appears to others. Other people's assessments, their approval, their regard, their specific opinions about the self's adequacy or inadequacy carry a weight that the authentic self does not assign them, not because the authentic self is indifferent to genuine feedback or genuine connection, but because its sense of its own reality does not depend on external confirmation in the same way that the adapted selves did. As the authentic self emerges, this relationship with external assessment begins to shift. The critical opinion that previously produced significant interior disturbance begins to produce something more like genuine curiosity. Is this accurate, and if so, what does it reveal? The approving opinion that previously produced significant relief begins to produce something more like simple acknowledgement. This person sees something real. The assessment becomes information rather than verdict, interesting rather than definitive. This shift is not the performance of not caring what others think. It is the genuine consequence of a self that is developing enough genuine interior ground that it no longer requires external confirmation to feel real. The eighth sign, and the most quietly significant of all, you have begun to feel, in specific moments, genuinely at home in your own life. Not continuously, not in every moment or every context, but in specific, ordinary, entirely unremarkable moments, a particular morning, a specific conversation, a moment of genuine creative engagement or genuine relational presence. A quality of genuine inhabitation that the adapted self, for all its competence and all its social skill, rarely produced. The adapted self is always slightly elsewhere, slightly ahead of the present moment in its management of the next one, slightly outside the experience in its monitoring of how the experience appears. Slightly not quite fully here, because fully here requires the full presence of the genuine self, and the adapted self learned to keep the genuine self at a slight but significant distance from the life being lived. The moments of genuine inhabitation that begin to appear as the authentic self emerges are not spectacular. They do not announce themselves. They are simply, and this simplicity is their entire significance, genuinely present. The person who notices them is not transported or transformed. They are simply, for a specific and unremarkable moment, actually here. That quality of genuine presence, available in ordinary moments, requiring no special conditions, arising naturally from a self that is finally, gradually, beginning to inhabit its own life, is the most complete sign available that the authentic self is genuinely emerging, not arriving all at once, not completing itself in any single dramatic moment, but genuinely, quietly, in the specific ordinary texture of a life that is becoming, slowly and honestly, more genuinely its own. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the adapted version, not the version that learned to be enough by being what was required, who you truly are, which has been quietly emerging all along.